Authority members: Draymond.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Karazian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Yusefian.
Here.
Chairman Weaver.
Here. May we have your report, please?
The agenda for the November 13, 2007 joint public meeting of the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, November 8, 2007 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Will you please read the first item?
The item on this agenda is Director of Planning and Director of Community Development and Housing regarding status of condominium conversion policy. At 1A is council motion to maintain current policy. At 1B is council motion directing staff to return to council with a report on alternatives to the existing policy.
Mr. Starbird.
Yes, it appears Mr. Hagani drew the short straw on this one, so he'll be giving the staff report. Hassan?
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council and the Housing Authority. This item was not put on the agenda by staff. You asked us to bring back the condo conversion policy for your review. And Laura Stotler, the principal planner, who's been working on this particular report several times before you and who has overseen the processing of several conversions, is going to give you a very brief slide presentation on this matter.
Oops. All right. I know there's a way to forward this thing.
You can just click it in advance. Just click there.
This one? Okay. Mayor Najarian, members of the Council and Housing Authority. Our current conversion policy was adopted by Council in December of 2005. And what it says is that the buildings that are currently at or below general plan density can convert as long as they meet current parking requirements at the time they were built. We also have density waivers that are considered on a case-by-case basis. And essentially, criteria for that case-by-case basis is whether or not an applicant can show that they were in the process to convert on or prior to June 7th, 2005. Here's a little history. In February 2005, we received, the Planning Department received an opinion from the City Attorney that said conversions are to meet the general plan densities at the time of the subdivision. This comes straight from our code where it says general plan densities must be met for all residential subdivisions, and Planning had requested that there be clarification. Does that mean general plan densities at the time it was built, or at conversion, result was conversion? So following that opinion, on June 5th, 2005, Planning staff returned to a joint meeting of the Council and also the Housing Authority to look at options. At that time, we looked at exempting conversions from general plan densities when they were already in the process, and it was adopted that, yes, projects that were already in the process as of June 7th, 2005 received a blanket waiver. For the general plan densities, anybody after that was not considered suitable for a subdivision under our current code without a waiver. And then in November 2005, we came back to the Council and Housing Authority and said, well, what criteria would we look at if there was going to be a waiver? There was an agreement that, yes, for new conversions, they must meet current general plan densities. However, there were several projects that were somewhere in the process. They hadn't actually had an application, but they were already somewhere in the process. Either they had sent out notices, or they had come and met with staff, or they had received, they had met with our planning staff and had actually prepared some of the exhibits. I said, what do we do with those people that were in a limbo? And on December 5th, that's when Council adopted our current policy. It said, well, as long as you could prove that you were somewhere in the process, you could, the Council would grant a waiver on a case-by-case basis, and that's what you have been doing. And again, the criteria was proof of intent to convert, and then also some people were given tenant conversion notices on or before June 7th. So those people were allowed to proceed even if they didn't actually have an application in at that time. In July 2006, we brought back to you a council report at your request saying, do you want to have consider a change in conversion standards? At that time, it was decided that you would make no changes in the policy. Subsequent to that, there was a discussion, said, well, let's bring this back in May of 2007 to say, well, Are you interested in looking at it again? And that's why we're here today. We received direction, so yes, let's bring this back and we'll look at it again to see if we want to make any changes. Our recent activity is that we have been considering units for density waivers. Since you adopted the policy in December 2005, we have 9 projects, conversion projects, which have received waivers. They total 160 units. We also had one of those projects in which it was brought up maybe a consideration for affordable housing units would be required for a waiver. Ultimately, they were not required to have affordable units, but that discussion was on the table. And so we're bringing forward today just an option. Option number 1 is to continue with our current policy in which conversions must meet the density as it currently exists today under the general plan, or they need a density waiver. And then option 2 would be to return with another conversion policy alternatives for future discussion. And that concludes staff's presentation.
Thank you. I have a request to speak. Why don't we hear from the public first? Mr. Milano, you've submitted 2 cards, one for 1A and 1B, but I think our policy dictates we treat that just as one item. So, how much time do you need?
5 minutes. I'll try to keep it below 9 minutes, but this is a fairly extensive document, and I have gone through it, and I have a significant number of ideas that I'd like to bring forth, at least for discussion.
I'll give you 4 minutes, Mr. Milano. Like that.
All right. Well, maybe what I should do in the future is probably prepare a document with taking each issue, similar to what I did with regard to the EIRs, and approach it in the same manner. What I'd like to present to you, my name is Herbert Milano, and members of the Redevelopment Agency and City Council and City staff. I would like to make a suggestion that a decision with regard to the condominium conversion policies for the city be looked at as part of an overall strategic objective for the city, because I cannot see how you could make that kind of policy outside of an overall strategic objective. And let me mention the following issue. It is my understanding that as the city will be in need to obtain additional sources of revenue, that there is probably no better way of reaching for that additional property tax revenue without having to build additional buildings throughout the city of Glendale. The condominium conversion probably gives you the greatest amount of return for the least amount of infrastructure impact. Condominium conversions need to be looked at in as much as a city policy would be with regard to the ratio that we have concerning home ownership versus renters. We now have 38% home ownership and 62% rental housing. And I don't know if that is really a good policy for any city to try to maintain and promote. We all figure that rental housing is good for a city, but we have just north of us La Cañada, they're doing very, very well without the additional rental housing. Now, as a landlord, I'd like to, I know that this is perhaps an opportunity for me to convert my building, so there is a particular financial interest in looking at this, but I look at it in some other way as well. When you make condominium conversions, you will not have the additional traffic. You won't necessarily have the additional water usage. You won't have the additional energy usage. You will not have the additional parking impact uses unless you make additional demands on these new condominium conversions. We, I think, have significant opportunities to direct the city towards a specific goal. And what should be the strategic goal for the city of Glendale? Should it be 50-50? We all know that home ownership generally will create the conditions in which more families partake in a civic process. And I think that for any city, that is a good thing to promote. But if you make it too restrictive, and if you make it such that we need to comply with new density requirements, you're going to put a significant strain in the availability of moving more and more properties in this direction, if that's the overall strategic direction that you want to take. We have opportunities to perhaps create other citywide policies. For example, I think it would be incredibly beneficial to promote affordable housing through this process for new teachers who cannot afford to live in the city of Glendale. I have many other ideas, but these are just some of the issues that I wanted to bring up, because many of the cons that are listed here on page 4 can actually be rebutted quite effectively, but they can be rebutted primarily if you have an overall strategic plan for the city with regard to housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I don't have any more cards on it from the public. I believe my colleagues were interested in this. I know I wasn't the one who
I wasn't either. I'm
was
satisfied.
excited about revisiting it, so
I'm satisfied with the current policy, Mr. Mayor.
thank you. Any comments from,
At the time, I think my interest in it was that this whole issue predates my tenure on the council.
Exactly.
Exactly. And yet, I was having to cast a vote, a rather contentious vote, actually, based on some of this. I wanted to know more. And I try not to drag my colleagues through that often, but occasionally I think it is important because it's affecting other people.
Mr. Quintero?
Well, I'm satisfied with the current policy. However, I am a believer that condominium conversions of existing buildings is a good idea. And I think we need to do whatever we can in the city of Glendale to promote those possibilities for first-time home buyers or empty nesters. And one of the issues that always comes to mind in reading the report, issues having to do with safety, including fire safety. I think it's very important that all of the conversions be brought up to code, and that can also mean other issues besides safety. But I guess where I differ with some people is that I think they need to be converted and sold at what will be the market and appropriate price. In other words, if the parking isn't quite sufficient, or if somehow they don't meet the standards, aesthetic or otherwise, of new properties, then they're not going to fetch that kind of money in the market. So I'm just, I hope, I think with the cycle we're coming into a cycle where there isn't going to be a whole lot of condominium conversion, if any, for quite a while, but eventually it should pick up again, and then I hope that some of these buildings are converted and that present renters have a chance to buy some of the units. So those are my ideas.
Mr. Youssef?
Thank you. I am not satisfied with the status quo. I think I'm pretty much where Mr. Quintero is, but I'll go a little bit further. I think what's important is for us to recognize what does a condo conversion do in the community, and does it actually harm the community or help the community? I tend to be an advocate that thinks that it actually helps the community. If you convert an 8-unit that currently zoned for 6-unit, and that's what this is all about. It currently zoning says you can build only 6 units, and in 1980 a building was built under the current code. In those times it was 8 units. They build an 8 units, and they build a parking for it. If you want to convert them today, you cannot do that because it is not meeting the density. So how does that hurt this city? Does it add more people? No. Does it add more congestion? No. How does it help the city? If you have a building owner decide to convert this property, that building owner invests more money in that building. That person spends more money renovating the building. It's very simple. You just drive in northern part of the town and look at some of the apartment buildings that were there, and they have been converted. And what they used to be and what they are now is night and day. It is gorgeous now, because now they have to apply to and appeal to a different group of people who are going to actually pay money. So they will be spending a whole bunch of money trying to renovate the building. They're also going to do exactly what Mr. Quintero was saying, building code upgrades. If an apartment building is an apartment building, they don't have to put sprinklers in, they don't have to provide all the other stuff that condominium conversions requires. When you do that, you're required to do all those building upgrades. Generally, people who own their condominiums, the people who buy those condos, there are fewer people who live in those condos than they live in apartment building because there are fewer transient people there. And the other thing is it creates more affordable housing. Not affordable housing in ways that we think of. They are not subsidized by the city. These are units that are going to fetch a little bit less money than a brand-new condominium will because it does not have all the amenities as a brand-new condominium, and besides, it is considered to be a used building or a converted building. So when you purchase those or when they sell those, they are going to be below market, and in many instances, that becomes many people's first attempt to homeownership. They're able to get there and buy that condo for $300,000 when they have to pay $500,000 for a new one. That's what it does. So ultimately, is conversions of apartments for the city a bad thing? No, it's actually a good thing. Does it increase density? No, because it's already there. You're not building new structures. Those structures are already there. Does current policy allow for that type of movement? No, it doesn't. The current policy dealt with all the pipelines. So if you were a pipeline project and you wanted to come, you could come in here and you have to prove that you were in the pipeline. Yes, we have a policy that says you can appeal that decision of the zoning administrator or the planning director and come to the city. But in order for you to come to the city and prove that, you still have to prove you were part of the pipeline and your project started prior to that date. So in a way, current policy discourages condo conversions that do not meet the current density of the city. That's why I thought that we needed to do what this city did for 10 years. And once in a while, when the economy improves, people do some conversions. When it's bad, they don't. But when those 160 units are created, I will tell you those 160 units that are converted not going to sell at $500,000-$600,000 what a regular condo sells. They're going to be much cheaper, and it also gives the first opportunity to the renters who are there to become homeowners, to achieve what we all want in this country, which is the American dream, to call something your own. And that's why I wanted this to be discussed. But if my colleagues are happy, they would like to have people stay in their apartments, so be it. Thank you.
Well, since this colleague is not happy and doesn't want all people to stay in their apartments, certainly I'm happy because I also get very sensitive to somehow, and I don't mean to imply you said this, Mr. Yosefian, but other people that I somehow feel that, gee, if you're a renter, you're somehow not a full American. You're
I
not
didn't say
quite.
that.
No, I know you didn't. That's what I just finished saying. But just in general, sometimes renters are somehow a little less than property owners. Not at all. Not at all. However, Mr. Yosefian, for the sake of discussion, what would you do to change the current codes so that we can encourage more condominium conversions?
Well, I think if this council would like to look at every single one of those, that's fine with me, but I think we need to modify the criteria that which we judge that project. I think we need to allow people who would like to apply, and if this council would like to look at every single project and see whether or not this is the type of project they would like to be approved, then we will approve it. But currently, the criteria, the way it exists, it says you cannot do that unless you were a pipeline project and unless you were at such and such date. And that basically puts a damper on anybody else who wants to try for this.
Mr. Draymond.
Okay, this is interesting to me. This is not rocket science. Everybody understands that the benefits of condo conversion, not just in Glendale, but if you read a newspaper, ever crack open a paper in the last 10 years, you understand that nationwide this kind of issue is being looked at. Yes, we know it doesn't increase, as Mr. Yusefian says, does not increase the density necessarily, parking issues, all of that, and something that Mr. Yusefian left out, but I'm sure it was just an oversight, is it creates stakeholders in an area that perhaps have more pride of ownership, and therefore, neighborhoods tend to improve, just in terms of quality of life and their demands to us as elected officials in terms of providing benefits and so on. But as I listened, the only issue that I heard raised was the pipeline issue. I mean, all of the benefits of home ownership, we all know that. To me, that's just not rocket science. That's absolute basic. We all get that. Everybody gets that. But what I'm not hearing is, so then, other than the pipeline issue, was there another issue, Mr. Yusefian, or is that the primary one?
Well, my main, I think, as we went through this issue, the previous council set a certain criterias, and I think Mrs. Slotler, one of my favorite people, works in the planning, did a very good job of explaining what those criterias were. Those criterias were applicable to the people who had applied prior to our zone change. And prior to you coming on this dais, Mr. Draymond, this council grappled with many of them, with the exception of I think 601 was on Palm Drive, were the only one that you had to deal with. But nevertheless, we dealt with most of those. Now, many others did not apply anymore because they had not started the process prior to us changing the rule. And many who had purchased the properties with an intent to do that, since they could not prove those criterias, they basically dropped it. And that's the whole issue. If, as policy, general policy in this city, we would like to see some conversions, I think there needs to be a more calculated and better thought process put into coming up with a way of allowing that than what we have currently on the books.
Mr. Draymond.
I understand all of that, and again, I want to come back to, so then, the same exact question again, because I'm not getting an answer here, and I really want to get a focus on this. I understand the history of it. That's not my confusion. I've read the report, and I'm well aware of it long before coming to council. I was here in the audience on a number of occasions when these issues came through. My question is there something other than the pipeline issue that is of concern to you? Because if that's the one, then let's address that. I'm saying I understand what the pipeline issue is. I want to know whether there is something beyond that.
It's the criteria.
Okay.
Mr. Starber.
Mr. Mayor, to be clear, and I'll ask Mr. Garcia to help me out here if I'm not speaking accurately, but the issue would be the need to change the code that would allow condo conversions to be approved without those units meeting the current density requirement. The change that occurred was really a policy matter. The code had required that condo conversions meet to meet the general plan required that condo conversions essentially comply with the density. Mm-hmm. The staff had been making an interpretation of what had been a code provision related to parking standards that said you don't need to meet you need to meet the parking standards that were in effect when your building was built, not the current ones. The staff had construed that to also apply to the density of the number of units. We came to the council and said, gee, we think that may be an overreach of that interpretation. Council said, you're right. From now on, units have to conform with existing density standards, and that's when the pipeline process was established to not catch people who had begun the process, not catch them in the middle of the stream, so to speak. But the key policy question is, do you want to permit condo conversions so that individuals don't necessarily have to meet the current density requirements. And if indeed you begin to walk down that road, what other standards, if any, would you want to put in place that units would have to meet in order to be considered for conversions? I think the key question here is, if you're going to permit conversions, there should be some definite standards that people know that if they meet them, they can do it. Not necessarily coming in and hoping they can get 3 votes on the city council to do it, but having established standards so that if you're going to allow conversions, people know what those standards are going to be.
Well, let me just chime in, let everyone know where I'm at, and not to bring up old business, but the last pipeline project that came through at 601 Palm really left a bad taste in my mouth as to how we dealt with dealing with the conversions, going from requiring some affordable housing to a $250,000 payment to Habitat, and then poof, that disappeared. But more to the point, I have no problem with the concept of converting apartments into condos. I think all the home ownership arguments and points are well taken. However, the problem that I have is that this city council, on a 4/5 vote, which is not easy to get, decided to downzone many areas of the city. They decided to downzone it because they discovered that it was just too dense. Current zoning was too dense and causing too much effect on the quality of life for the residents. It was their intention. Obviously, they knew that that by passing a downzoning ordinance, that overnight people aren't going to just poof and vanish into thin air and density will go down. But it was their intention that when the uses changed, that the density would then drop down to its proper level. The problem that you have when you have a condo conversion is you've got a borderline, marginally successful apartment building, you convert it into condos, and all the arguments about people having a stake, yes, they have a stake. They have a stake in a building that is substandard, and it's in many ways inferior to other opportunities for them to purchase housing. And you're locked in there. I don't know of any instance in this city where a condominium project has been raised and taken down to the ground. We've seen many, many instances where apartments have been raised, brought up to new standards, new uses, new units, but we've never seen it happen with condominiums, and as long as people have a stake in that building, it is never going to go down. And so what that's going to do is, in those areas where this city council, 4/5 of them, and it may have been unanimous as far as I know, decided that the area and neighborhood should be downzoned, areas such as South Glendale should be downzoned. This is an end run around that zoning. In many instances, it's a spot zoning, maybe not technically, legally, but in the spirit of spot zoning, this is what it is. You're taking one building and saying, well, we're going to make this a ownership, and that downzoning that the council voted on, well, that doesn't matter. We're not going to hold you to that. The city of LA has experienced a lot of problems with this, and although home ownership is great, rental is good also. Just to think that we're going to continue to go to home ownership, we have to understand that although that might be a admirable goal, that there are many people living in the city who are renting. All the problems we see in South Glendale, there's no chance of that getting done if the owners of those buildings realize they can cash out, go into condos. All the parking problems, all the congestion that we have down there that the city wanted to change is going to go, it's basically going to vanish. So again, if there's a conversion that's willing to be taken place where there's no discrepancy between the current zoning and what's proposed, I'm all for it. But if we're going to perpetuate a high-density environment, a high-density building and neighborhood, I'm just against that. It will destroy and perpetuate the decline in the quality of life in those areas. And that's where I'm at. Mr. Quintero.
Well, what Mr. Starbird was alluding to, that is exactly the issue. As a matter of policy, what we want to do. Do we want to work with the code and make some changes to try to encourage home ownership or not? In terms of the downzoning is about future projects. So these areas that have been downzoned, the idea there is that whatever goes into that particular site is going to be less dense than the surrounding units. Then in terms of the existing units, once again, I mean, it's not a different use. It's basically going from a rental situation to a home ownership, but the square footage remains the same, the parking spaces remain the same, and I think there will be a certain level of investment by the property owner prior to applying for the condominium and selling the condominiums. And, of course, once it's owned by a condo association, I believe the standards will generally be higher than when it's strictly an investment property. And, no, this isn't the answer to affordable housing in the city of Glendale. There's no question about that. We've got a lot more need than what would come from these conversions. But overall, I mean, I just think we have to be flexible and look to see what we can do to try to encourage conversions. And quite frankly, I don't think anything is going to come of anything we say on this dais for quite a few years to come.
Mr. Yusefian.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In 1986, when the city downzoned this area, I was here. I was sitting over there. And I remember the individuals who were here. I wish you had an opportunity to talk to Larry Zarian, because he was sitting in here when we did this. At that time, when the area was blanketly downzoned, actually, and later on, I think there was a little bit of a downzoning in 91, but it was not as much. The city council at the time specifically dealt with the condo conversions. In our zoning code, and if my memory corrects me, there's I think a page or two that deals with condo conversions, not just on parking alone. It does deal with how many square feet you have to have for storage and what the size is and so on and so forth. That was all made. Where the problem was created at the time, they changed the zoning and they did allow for that type of conversions, but they did not modify the general plan. And the problem was that it was not, so the zoning and the general plan were not consistent. That's where we ran into problems. So the code was being interpreted as a zoning code for over 10 years, or I think 13 years. That's when, at one point, one of the staffers, the new staffers in the city, who was relying more on the written word rather than what their experience had been, because they were here, as they read both sides, they go, wait a second, the code says you can do this, but the general plan says you can't. So which one is accurate, the code or the general plan? That's where they went to the city attorney, and the city attorney's decision was general plan supersedes the code. That's when they came to us and said, what do you want to do? At that point, there was 3 votes to move in the direction of upholding the general plan. So, and Mr. Stauber is accurate. If we want to change this, we need to modify the general plan, and if we want to modify the code, we can, but there is currently code in place that says any buildings that was built prior to 1973, I think, or 78, you have to meet those parking standards, and it has a whole slew of stuff. You have to upgrade it for electrical and fire sprinklers and a whole bunch of stuff on building safety stuff. And that's what it was. So just wanted to refresh some of my colleagues' memory. That council, when it did the downzoning, knew real well that they wanted to allow for some of the conversions. Laura, did you say 160 units that was converted?
160.
Yeah, we've converted 160 units since December 2005.
And how many units do we have as rental?
Oh, I don't know offhand. I couldn't answer.
Well, we count roughly 60% of the 72,000 units in the city, so roughly 40-some thousand rental units.
Okay, so as you can see, the numbers are not that huge that it's going to make a real huge shift, and it doesn't happen very often either. So,
Mr. Starbird.
It might be useful to have Mr. Garcia note, if the council were to change the policy, what procedurally would you need to do, what legislation would need to be adopted?
Can I say something first before he tells us what we can do?
Mr. Weaver, you always have priority over staff.
Thank you. So I seem to recall we started into this because there was a rash of condo conversion projects hitting us. Like blue blazes. Everybody all of a sudden was coming in with condo conversions because the people that bought the apartments, knowing they could convert to condos, were going to reap a good amount of profit at the expense of the poor apartment owner. So we decided, as I recall, as a council, to put a halt to this if they didn't meet current density and parking. We have some of the densest areas in the United States of America in this city. We tried to downzone to eliminate this density and correct the parking situation we have. Now we're going to open the door again to keep the same density with not adequate parking to allow certain people to make a big profit at the expense of the people that are living there? No. It doesn't make any sense to me to start fiddling with something. We went through this for so long a time. And the ones that wanted to get in because of the deadline, they wanted that profit. It was all about profit. They were out there for the people or anything. Give me a break. And we did the pipeline. To me, it's done. We set a policy, and as this council wants to start setting new policies and open the door again, and the floodgate will open wide.
Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council. Let me just, I think, address a couple of points that have been made and then also discuss the sort of procedural requirements for a change to the policy. The policy, again, was brought to the council because our office had determined that in order to do a conversion, that conversion had to comply with the general plan density limits. What was brought to you then was a policy on how to do the waiver process, because the code provides that any standards that are, except for certain enumerated ones that are in the Title 16 of our code, which deals with subdivisions, any of the other requirements, including the general plan density limits, could be waived by the council on a case-by-case basis. And so what was brought to you was whether or not to do them on sort of this pipeline approach, or maybe an approach having to do with the standards of the conversion. So if a particular project was so much under density, or so much over density, or met certain parking requirements. And the choice of the council was to do the pipeline approach. In other words, projects which had either submitted before June 7th, 2005, or had shown the substantial intent to convert. So that's what was brought to you. And so, again, the council could change the policy essentially by motion if it wanted to. Not at this meeting. It would have to come back to a subsequent meeting, because here is only to give direction. But that policy could be changed to say the council wants to look at them on a case-by-case basis, subject to these standards, subject to the physical attributes of the projects, or to say the council could say we want to look at each and every individual project. That was an option that was available. Or the council could decide they want to change the requirement that's in Title 16 to say condominium conversions no longer have to comply with the general plan density limits. There are a number of procedural ways to do it. But essentially, by motion, the council can revise its existing policy, which requires that projects have been submitted before June 7th, 2005, or shown the substantial intent to convert prior to that date.
Mr. Garcia, currently, if a apartment building owner wanted to make a conversion, and he would go to planning staff and they say, sorry, but you don't meet standards, could that individual bring his appeal, his case before council, and present it to us for a waiver? Without, obviously, we don't have set standards in place now, but is that his right to bring it to us and make his pitch as to why he should be afforded
Essentially, yes. The code provides that upon the request of an applicant, the council can waive any standard other than the certain enumerated ones, one of them being parking that was existing at the time the project was built. And those can be waived on a case-by-case basis. What we've taken from the council motion is to say we don't want to grant any waivers unless you've met this deadline of June 7th, 2005. And so I'm not sure exactly how the mechanics have worked when applicants have come to the counter, but my understanding is that they come and the council and they're told by the planners, this is the motion that the council has adopted, that they will not, they do not want to hear applications to convert or to waive the density limit requirement unless you've met this June 7th, 2005 deadline.
Is that what we tell them? We say council does not want to hear it?
Well, not those terms, but...
I mean, I hope we don't. They're certainly allowed their right, their due process and all that. What do we tell them?
We give them a copy of the motion from December 20th, 2005 that says this is the criteria you've adopted. And to my knowledge, no one's actually said that hasn't met the criteria has come in and said, well, we want to apply for a waiver, but if they did, we would certainly take it to you.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds fair, at least. Mr. Draymond.
All right. Well, I hear all the points about what was done in the past. So I guess what I'm going to say is going to upset some of my colleagues. I, for one, would like to, I know we can't make that decision here, and Mr. Garcia has made that point clear. I would like to have some more conversation about this, and I would like to look again at the policy. That is, if there are if there's a consensus on this dais to do so.
I think you have at least two
and
other gentlemen
the issue to me is again the magic of this pipeline date. I can't help but think about the fact that there are also a number of financial benefits to the city as well with regard to home ownership. And I can't help but think also about where I live. The building I live in a condo, as most of you know, and that was built in 1974 as a condominium, but because of the market, it opened as an apartment and didn't become a condominium until late 1977, 78. So those things help people get their feet under them, helps them become stakeholders, yes, but it also helps the city, too, so paying some property tax as well. Anyway, I'd like to look at the policy and see if I can discover what the magic of this pipeline date is that is going to create the opening of the floodgates. And Mr. Weaver, if that happens, I will be the first to paddle on over in my rowboat and pick you up so that none of us get washed away in that flood. But I do want to take a look at it if there is some consensus.
Mr. Chairman, we'll find out, because I'll move 1A now, and we'll find out if there's 3 votes to do that.
There's a motion.
1A is to maintain the current policy.
Mr. Mayor, we might just point out 1A is to maintain the current policy. 1B would get to Mr. Draymond's comments. So 1B is to come back with a report on the alternatives to the current policy. 1A is to sustain the current policy.
Trying to cut to the chase.
I understand.
Well, I would like to second that. However, Mr. Weaver, I think it would be a futile attempt to hand the gavel to someone to second it, because I think it's 3-2 in favor of some change.
I can't believe what we went through.
Well, I'm willing to discuss it. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be radically changing my position, number one. But then the second thing is, let me just be clear, in terms of pipeline projects and non-pipeline, that's over as far as I'm concerned. I mean, to me, everybody will be starting with a fresh slate, so to speak, in terms of condo conversions. Someone that maintains, well, gee, I bought a building and I wanted to convert it to a condo. Hey, sorry, that train left the station months and months ago. So I'm just willing to look forward and see what we will ultimately decide on condominium conversions. That's all. Maybe there'll be just a few small changes, maybe there'll be bigger changes, but we can certainly talk about it. I also don't think with the kind of issues that the staff has been dealing with, I also don't think I'm in any hurry to receive a report anytime soon. It'll happen when it happens. I wouldn't say this was my top priority on land use issues at this point.
Mr. Starbird?
Well, I might note, given the current market, it probably isn't a burning issue.
This is great.
But what we would anticipate, if indeed the motion at 1B carries, would be bringing you back a report that doesn't necessarily deal with the pipeline, but deals with what is your policy on condo conversions. If indeed you want to permit them as a policy, under what standards and process do you want to permit them?
Yeah, whether it's current density or
That's right.
current parking,
Exactly.
or
There could be a lot of different alternatives to look at.
And how much the variation could be.
The,
so on and so forth.
The motion at 1A fails for lack of a second. Is there a motion for 1B?
Move 1B.
Second.
Do you have enough direction as to what we're
Yes.
thinking about? Okay. Let's take a roll call on 1B.
Councilmember Straman?
Yes.
Quintero?
Yes.
Weaver?
no.
Yusefian?
Aye.
Mayor Najarian?
No.
Mr. Mayor, wanted to
Mr.
think to the city attorney, I think it's extremely important we deal with the general plan item when you're coming back. This is what happened in the past, in 1986. My predecessors changed zoning things, didn't deal with the general plan, and that's how we ended up where it is. So whatever we do in here, whatever policy we set, the general plan and the code need to read together. So we don't end up having
Yeah, I understand.
some council members 15 years from now and a new city attorney and new planning director go, but it doesn't jive, and then replay this again, No Groundhog's Day.
I think to a large extent they are. Mr. Hagani could correct me if I'm wrong. They've probably been corrected in a large number of instances.
That's accurate. We have corrected to a large to a large extent, and we will be redoing the land use element of the general plan, in which case we will study every area to see, for consistency, what's on paper and what's physically out in the world. So,
I understand these are all council motions. I just wondered why we're dragging the housing people through this where they don't get a thing to say about this anyhow. I guess we got to do
We
joint.
thought they'd be interested.
Is there a
It
motion?
is about
I hear a
housing.
murmur.
Is there a motion to adjourn for council?
So moved. Second.
Council's adjourned?
And for the Housing Authority,
So moved.
stand adjourned.
That's why he was here.
That's 3:35. Now we got redeveloped.
GRA.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Glendale Redevelopment Agency meeting of